grab a hold of your Bibles, and we're going to go to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And we are going to read verse 1 through 9. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 through 9. We're talking about a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. Solomon, as he wrote this book, was stating the reality that mankind has always faced. There's a lot of labor, a lot of toiling, a lot of suffering that is accomplished and done under the sun. And if we don't have salvation, if we don't have the hope of eternal life, what's the point of existing? What's the point of living life if we don't have the hope of going to heaven? In other words, if we live to die and that's it, what's the point? Apostle Paul corrected the thinking of the church in Corinth because many had that mindset, we're going to die anyway, so how about we just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And in that chapter, he took a lot of time explaining there is the resurrection, that true life does not begin at birth, but for a Christian, true life truly begins at death. So if we do not have the hope that goes beyond death, what's the point of all the laboring and all the toiling and all the seasons that we go through in life? Now, go to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We're going to read verse 1 through 9. And then we'll go exactly where we left off on Wednesday night, rather. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 through 9. Solomon said, to everything there's a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to rend and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. What profit hath he that worketh? What profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboreth? All right, so this morning we're going to start on the verse that says, a time to rend and a time to sow. That's in verse 7. A time to rend and a time to sow. Now, what does it mean when Solomon said there's a time to rend and a time to sow? I believe when he uses the word rend, he's talking about a tradition that the Jewish people had during the time of mourning, during the time of grief, during the time of sadness. They would tear, they would rend their garments as an outward expression of the grief that was taking place in their hearts. I'll give you some verses to back this up. Notice, if you would, in Genesis chapter 37 and verse 29. Genesis chapter 37 and verse 29. Verse 29 says this, and Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. And what did he do to his clothing? King James says, and he rent or tore his clothes. He had sorrow and he had grief because his brother was missing. Here's another scripture to show that it was a common tradition to tear your clothing. Now, you have to be going through a lot of grief, because I don't buy expensive shirts, but the shirts I do have, I like. I don't want to tear my shirts. So we don't have that tradition today, but the Jews, that was an outward sign of expression of the grief that was taking place in their heart. They would tear or rend their clothing. Here's another scripture to prove that point. Go to Genesis chapter 44 and verse 13. Genesis chapter 44 and verse 13. We could read verse 12. And he searched and began at the eldest and left at the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Then they rent, or they tore their clothes, and laded every man his donkey, and returned to the city. So when they realized the cup was in Benjamin's bag, and they knew that he was going to be brought back to Egypt, and he's not going to return to his father, that was grief that took over them, and they tore their clothing. We'll look at one more, and then we're going to move on. I just want to give you some verses to show that it was a tradition. We're talking about Solomon. Solomon said, he's mentioning the seasons under the sun. And there is a season where we not literally tear our clothing today, but it's a representation of grief. It's a representation of sadness. Go to Job chapter 1 and verse 20. Job chapter 1 and verse 20. Job is before the book of Psalms. Job chapter 1 and verse 20. So after Job was informed about not only his livestock, possessions, but also his children, how they passed away, notice what he did in verse 20. Job chapter 1 and verse 20, it says, Then Job arose and did what to his mantle? He rent or tore his robe or mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshiped. So when Solomon says there's a time to rend and a time to sow, I truly believe that one of the experiences that all of us are going to experience is a season of grief and sadness. It's unavoidable. You cannot escape it. It's just a matter of time. Something's going to happen in our lives, whether it has to relate to our health, relationships in our family, someone passes away, someone that we love dearly. There's going to be that season of tearing our clothing because of sadness. And then it says a time to rend, but it also says a time to sow. I do not believe it's talking about literally sewing back the mantle. I believe sowing up again is when the season of mourning is past and men return again to the routine of their daily life. Sowing up again is when the season of mourning is past and men return again to the routine of their daily life. We see that in our lives. Many of you have lost your parents, lost family members, and there's a season of that where you tear your mantle. In our day of age, that would be figuratively. But you tear your mantle figuratively, expressing the sadness in your heart. And many people take time off of work. They don't work for a couple weeks. And they try to spend time with their family, and they're going through that mourning. But as time goes on, because time goes on no matter what. The sun rises and the sun sets no matter what you're going through. Time does not stand still and say, you know, you're going through a lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press pause. And you're not going to lose any time until you get better. And then I'll hit play again and time will move on. Time moves on no matter what we're going through. So we see us taking time off of work. Maybe we're not fulfilling some responsibilities because we're going through the season of mourning and grief, but then eventually the season of mourning begins slowly to subside. I'm not saying it's not there anymore, but we get to a point where we can kind of juggle, if you would, and kind of function, if you would, with the pain and also our daily functions. And as time goes on, we go back to our daily lives. And sometimes that's sad, isn't it? Because when somebody passes away, it's an opportunity for families to get together and to share those sincere, intimate moments with one another. And then when we all go back to our daily routine, we don't see one another anymore. But once again, this is life. Remember, the seasons that Solomon is describing under the sun that's exercised by mankind, it doesn't mean we enjoy all the seasons. It doesn't mean we agree with all the seasons. But nevertheless, all of us are going to experience all these seasons. And as I mentioned before, as Christians, we thank God that He will never leave us nor forsake us. That Jesus, He said, teaching them to observe whatsoever things I commanded you, and lo, I am with you even unto the end of the world. That Jesus is going to be with us through all seasons, even unto the end of the world. And we have that consolation. All right, moving on. The next verse that we're going to focus on that's mentioned in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, I believe verse 7 or 8, it says, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Now, when I first read that long time ago, I really thought it was talking about using wisdom, when to speak, when not to speak. But I think it's talking about keeping silence once again in grief. And later on I'm going to expand it in a broader and general sense, but I really think that Solomon is talking about that there's a time where we are silent in our grief. When we're going through grief, do we want to go out and celebrate? I was going to say party. The word party doesn't have to be sinful, but do we want to go out and go to birthday parties and family gatherings and have a good time? No, we kind of want to remain in our silence. And I want to give you a verse to show that I believe in what Solomon was talking about, a time to keep silence, was silence in grief. Notice in Job chapter 2, verse 12 and 13. Job chapter 2, verse 12 and 13. As you recall, I mentioned it earlier, Job went through a tremendous amount of adversity and pain and suffering. And his companions, which they were not the best companions, but nevertheless, his companions went to go visit Job with the intent to console him. And notice in verse 12 and 13. I'm in Job chapter 2, verse 12 and 13. And when they lifted up their eyes afar off and knew him not, that's talking about Job's companions. When Job's companions lifted up their eyes afar off and knew him not, they didn't recognize Job, they lifted up their voice and wept, and they rent every one his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. So they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. They didn't speak. They sat with Job for 7 days and 7 nights and did not speak a word. They were 7 days and 7 nights with Job in silence. There's a time to keep silent. I believe Solomon, when he wrote that, is talking about silence in our grief. We can learn something from that, because I know when I have lost people because of death, and I had people come to me, they mean well, but sometimes people can say the wrong things. They have good intentions, but they can say the wrong things. Sometimes just being silent and being there with someone to support them through their sorrow goes a long way. So once again, before I expand it into a broader sense, I really believe the true meaning that Solomon brought to our attention, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, was not talking about wisdom, when to speak, when not to speak, but talking about there's a season where we are kept silence in our grief. We don't want to go out to birthday parties. We don't want to go out to graduation parties. We don't want to go out with family gatherings and celebrations, because we're so overwhelmed with grief. We want to remain in our silence. But I would like to now at this point take something that he said that was designed for this intent or this statement for this meaning, and I would like to expand it to a broader sense, because I do believe that we can learn something just from the statement. That as Christians, there is a time to speak and a time to stay quiet. How many of us have ever opened our mouth in a heated moment, and then later on, we regret speaking? And once you say those words, you're never going to get them back. The other individual should forgive and let go for their benefit, but sometimes individuals don't do that. Sometimes they have this, it's like a computer, I guess, that even if you hit delete on the history browser, it's still there. And some people, their brains are like a computer, that they say they forgave you, and then years later, they remember the date, they remember the week, they remember what you were wearing, they remember what restaurant, they remember what you were having for dinner as you got into that argument. They remember all these details. And so we have to be careful. I rather compose myself, and I'm not saying I've done this all the time, because I have failed many times. I said things that later on I regret. I've done it, you've done it, we all done it. But it's better to compose yourself and stay silent and allow your anger to subside, then communicate your thoughts. I don't know how true this is, but my dad mentioned this before, and I don't know how true this is. So this may not be true. But even if it's not true, it sounds good. I think he was talking about Japanese people at one time. They had a tradition where when they were angry, they did not say anything. What they did was they would write it down, and they would give it 3 days. And then after 3 days, they would read it. If they still felt that way, then they would communicate that message to the person they wanted to communicate with. But oftentimes, after 3 days, that is enough time for anger to subside. That's enough time for reason to come back into our minds. And then we think, yeah, I probably shouldn't say this. Number one, I don't feel that way anymore. Or if I do feel that way, it's not as strong. And so it really pays to ask God, Lord, give me wisdom that I may know when to speak and I may know when to keep silence. Notice, if you would, in Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 8. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 8. Many people stop talking to each other because things that were said. Many marriages end in a divorce because of things that were said. Many parents or children do not go around seeing each other because of words that were said. Now, we used to hear that expression back in the day, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. That is a lie. That's a lie. And we're not going to go there, but just to give some kind of credence to what I'm saying, when you read the book of James chapter 3, although that was talking about the teachers being not many masters, knowing that we should receive the greater condemnation, the principles are there. How the Bible says it's the tongue is poison. It's like fire. Poison kills, fire destroys. So words do have an impact. Our words can destroy our relationships. And so we have to ask God to help us to stay quiet when we need to stay quiet, and help us to know when to speak when we need to speak. All right, notice, if you would, in Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 8, it says, the wise in heart will receive commandments, but a prating fool shall fall. And I don't even know if I got the right verse on that. What is prating in your translation? Okay, that's why I brought that verse. All right, I knew I am not, I don't need to say this for you to know this, but I am not perfect, and I've wrote down verses before that I wrote down wrong and doesn't pertain to what I'm saying, but that's why I wrote that down. It says a babbling, I guess the King James has the word prating, fool shall fall. Another translation says babbling. The more you babble, especially when you're angry, especially when you're hurt, especially when you have a revengeful spirit, the more you babble, the more the situation is going to cause you to fall further and further. Notice in Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 23. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 23. I don't know, do you guys and ladies ever ask God in your prayer requests, help me with my tongue? Yeah. That's a good prayer request, isn't it? Lord, help me with my tongue. I notice in Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 23. A man had joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good is it? Isn't it nice to be able to refresh people by the words we speak right on time? Well, in order to make sure that we use the right words, we have to, as the Bible says in the book of James, be slow to speak, be quick to listen, and to be slow to anger, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. In order for us to say the right word in due season, how sweet and how good it is when a word spoken at the right time in due season, how sweet and good it is, then we have to be able to process better. And you're not allowing yourself to process better when we become very impulsive with our words. We need to ask God to give us the wisdom when to speak and when to keep silent. Go to Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 3. Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 3. This is a very powerful verse. And think about the power in this verse. He that keeps his mouth guards his mouth. He that keep his mouth keepeth his life. When I read that, I think to myself, how does my words and life correlate or relate to each other? He that keeps his mouth or guards his mouth keeps his life. Our words, they could get us in trouble. You could be at work and you're having a bad day and your boss directs you to do a certain task, but your boss does not direct you to do a certain task with pleasantness. Your boss is very rough and says something, and it rubs you the wrong way. And you fail to guard your mouth in order to keep your life, so you just go off the handle out of impulsiveness, and you just tell your boss off. Now your boss fires you. That's what, I'm just giving you one example, how he that guards his mouth will keep his life. Our impulsiveness and just speaking without thinking, it's going to cost us our job. Can you imagine? And there's been situations where it has happened where people go to court, face a judge. Is it very important to know how to guard your mouth in the court setting? No matter if you like it or not like it, agree or disagree, you're at the mercy of the judge. That your opinion in the court of law does not matter. It doesn't matter whatsoever. You're at the mercy of the judge. So what if the judge says something that you don't like and you become impulsive and you just say something very rude and disrespectful to the judge? He that keeps his mouth keeps his life. Now that you got disrespectful, instead of the judge being lenient, now the judge is going to be very firm on his sentence. And so those are just two examples that this is a very powerful verse. Memorize this verse and ask God to help you to bring this verse into reality in your life. But I want to read the whole verse again. Proverbs chapter, is it 15? 13 and verse 3, right? Okay, 13 and verse 3. It says, he that keepeth his mouth keepeth his life, but he that openeth wide his lips shall have destruction. let's go ahead and talk about like in church service. If somebody was to upset you in church service, what's better? To open wide your lips or just keep quiet? Sometimes do people open wide their lips? Well, I'm not going to go to church service this evening. I had an episode with an individual, we got into it. Well, number one, it takes two to tangle. The person that's trying to provoke eventually will get very bored playing this game alone. It takes two to tangle. So just guard your lips. Don't open wide your lips because it will lead to destruction. Yeah. But our pride gets in the way, and maybe somebody cuts in front of us. In case you didn't hear his example, he's talking about road rage, that it's better just no harm, no foul. That person cut me off, I get it, but they're okay, we're okay, just let it go. But then when we open wide our lips, and all, you're like, well, they can't hear me anyway, the windows are up. Listen, I may not be able to hear word for word what you're saying, but when you drive up and you look at me at a dirty look, and your body language is saying a lot, you have, or you give me the middle finger. I mean, that's also communication. Body language is a form of communication. Tone of voice is a form of communication, and words is a form of communication. And if I'm not mistaken, I read that 70% of our communication is body language. And then I think, I'm trying to do my math right and make sure I narrow it down right and cancel out the percentage. 20% of our communication is tone of voice. And like 10% is words. So that's why some people may say, well, I didn't say anything wrong. You might have said everything right, but your tone of voice and your body language said everything wrong. So going back to road rage, it's better just to no harm, no foul, rather than to provoke and then incite a possible dangerous situation. Yeah, so notice one more. Proverbs chapter 25, verse 11. Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 11. These are some good verses to write down, to read later on. And I think all of us, for the most part, struggle with the way we communicate. You get emotions involved, you get anger involved, you get hurt involved. I know we're hurt, but as I mentioned this before, and I'm going to mention it again, our hurt and our anger because of the hurt never gives us an excuse to say and do the wrong thing. God said, be you angry and sin not. The anger is normal. Be you angry and sin not. In other words, we're going to get hurt. We're going to get angry. That's normal. But don't allow that anger to cause you to sin. In this case, we're talking about our words. Don't allow the anger to cause you to say things that are hurtful and spiteful and mean, because our anger or our hurt does not give us an excuse to sin. So we need to ask God for help in this area in our lives. All right, Proverbs chapter 25, verse 11, it says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. That's what we want. We don't want to be a word spoken, a bad or a hurtful word, a spiteful word, a mean word spoken in the wrong season. No, we want a good word spoken in the right season. And maybe, and this is what it boils down to. And we're going to go to James, and then we're going to move on to what Solomon has to say next. We'll go to James real quick, chapter 3. I wasn't going to go there, but I think it's such an incredible chapter in regards to what we're saying that we're going to go ahead and spend a little bit of time on this. James chapter 3. James chapter 3. And I want to say this is what it boils down to. And maybe this morning or later on this morning when we talk in our message, or when I talk, and I guess you listen, in our message, we'll kind of hear this again. But what controls our words? It's our heart. Jesus said, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things. An evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil things. When people say things, a lot of people, and I, including myself, we say, I didn't mean it, or they push my button. Listen, you cannot squeeze lemon juice out of a lemon when there's no lemon juice. As long as there's still lemon juice in that lemon, you can squeeze lemon juice out of that lemon. But if there's no lemon juice, you can do all the squeezing and the lemon is dried up, it will not bring forth lemon juice. What am I saying? No matter what someone does to you, they cannot squeeze lemon juice out of you and say bad things if you had no lemon juice inside of you. You cannot squeeze something out of someone if that something's not in them to begin with. If you have good in your heart, the way you're going to respond in your words are good. But when there's already coffee brewing, it's just a matter of time before the coffee machine says, bing, done. Then someone does something to you, and then you respond such a way, and you're like, well, if they never have done that, I would never respond. No, no one can take something out of you that doesn't exist in you. So the power of our words is changing our hearts, changing our minds, changing what we decide to meditate on. When we do that, it's hard for someone to get a rise out of us. People that got a rise out of me, and it's happened. Later on, I'm thinking, I already had carnal thoughts in my mind. I already had carnal thoughts. I already had a war going in my mind that I was already losing. And then they got a rise out of me, and I don't blame that person. I'm like, that was me. That was me. I failed because I was already having carnality in my mind. And a carnal mind is thinking that's not governed by the Spirit of God. It's just mere human thinking that's not governed by God. So if I'm thinking jealous thoughts, that's carnal. It's not, that thought is not governed by the Spirit of God. So, yeah, we have to clean our hearts. But we do need wisdom when to speak, when to keep silent. Sometimes we don't have to always voice our opinion. I think sometimes we think that life doesn't move on unless I voice my opinion. That people cannot cope and make the right decisions unless I voice my opinion. We're not that powerful, people. We're not that powerful. We don't always have to voice our opinion. There's a time where we need to just be quiet. And there's a time that we need to talk or speak. I cannot dictate when that time is. We need God's wisdom. If any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given unto him. God could only lavish his wisdom and discernment. So you will know the time when to remain quiet and when to speak. I can say this without a doubt. If you're angry, it's probably a good time to remain silent. Yeah. If you're hurt, probably want to just remain silent for a while. All right, notice in James chapter 3. Now, we're going to read verse 1 because I want you to see the context. The context is not even talking about Christians in general. It's talking about the teacher. It's talking about the word master is not like Kung Fu, you're my master, or karate, you're my master. Master in the King James, in this chapter, is equivalent to like a teacher, a preacher that's bringing the word. So technically, I guess in this case, this chapter pertains more to me right now than you. But the principles can be applied universally. All right, notice if you would in James chapter 3, verse 1. My brethren, be not many masters or teachers, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. Is a church and the direction of the church based upon the evangelist directing and controlling? And I don't mean controlling to the point of controlling the way we use it, but controlling the direction of the body. I should say that. The church and the direction of the body, the church, which is where it's headed, is that controlled by the words of the evangelist, according to that verse? It is. And then later on he talks about a ship with a helm. Is that how you pronounce it? That even though a ship is very gigantic and there's so many waves, it's still directed and controlled by the helm. Talking about the master, keep in context, talking about the evangelist, that the church, the direction of church is going to be based on what the evangelist is teaching and preaching. That's why do not desire me to be a teacher, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. That's a lot of responsibility. Now, after explaining that, I'm going to keep going, and I want to apply it universally. But I want you to see it is talking about the evangelist. But now we're going to apply it universally, because there's principles here that all of us can benefit from, not just the evangelist. All right, notice if you would in verse 3. Behold, we put bits in the horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn about their whole body. If you have never gone horseback riding, you're not going to appreciate that verse. How many have gone horseback riding before? Okay. I have. I love horses, but when I'm on top of a horse, I am terrified, because they're a powerful force to reckon with. And it's true. You put that little device, that bit, that bridle, on a horse's mouth. You control it if you're a good rider. If you're someone like me, the horse is going to pick up on your fears and do what the horse wants to do. But if you're a good rider, as heavy as that horse is, as 10 times stronger the horse is than the rider, that little bit that controls his mouth will be able to control the horse. What is God trying to illustrate here about us? Now, I am applying it universally, but if we can control our mouths, just control it, then we can control the direction of our marriage. We can control the direction of our parenting. We can control the direction of our healthy relationships with those in the church and outside the church. We can control the relationship with our friends if we can just put that bit over our mouth and control it. Now notice in verse 4, behold also the ships, which though they be so great and are driven of fierce winds, yet are they turned about with a very small helm, whithersoever the governor or pilot wants. Your translation may have the word rudder. My translation has the word helm, if I'm pronouncing that right. But it's that gigantic boat, and although it is confronted with fierce winds, yet that boat can be controlled as far as the direction it's going with the rudder. That small little rudder can control the boat. That small little member of your body called the tongue can control, in a healthy and good way, many things in your life. And then notice in verse 5, even so the tongue is a little member. It's little. Oh, it won't hurt anybody. It's just words. Even so the tongue is a little member, and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth. How many have ever gotten small arguments with your spouse, small arguments with your children, small arguments with someone in the church? And there's a difference between reasoning and arguing. We need to do more reasoning. Can you reason and disagree at the same time? Yeah. Can you reason and have a discussion can you disagree and have a discussion at the same time? You can. But then, when emotions get involved, it turns to anger and it turns to arguing. So how many of us have ever argued over small matters? According to that verse, even small matters can kindle a fire. In order to destroy a huge forest, many miles, the forest is many miles as far as the land territory, rather. All it takes is just a little fire. It doesn't take a huge fire. So be careful, even with your daily lives, with getting involved in small arguments. Because even small arguments can kindle such a fire. You may kind of pacify and say, oh, it wasn't a big deal. It could be a big deal. It can spark a small fire. And then it says in verse 6, and a tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell. Well, what does that mean, to set on fire of hell? I believe, the way I understand it, is when we have words that are very destructive like fire, who's the one that is influencing those words? It's set on fire of hell. In other words, it's demonic, and Satan is the one inciting through you, through me, in my heart, those words to come out. And then it says, for every kind of beast and of birds and of serpents and of things in the sea is tamed and has been tamed of mankind. Go to San Diego and go to SeaWorld, and it's just amazing how they can tame a dolphin. It's amazing how they can tame a killer whale. It's amazing how they can tame these sea creatures. And it's so true. But although man can tame all these powerful animals, we fail to tame the tongue. And then it says, for every kind of beast and of birds and serpents and of things in the sea is tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but the tongue can no man tame. It is unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. The tongue is a force, a powerful force. With the tongue we have the power of life, and with the tongue we have the power of death. And although when Solomon said, there's a time to keep silent and a time to speak, I believe that he literally meant it. There's a time to keep silent in grief, like Job. For 7 days, they were around each other, but they were silent in their grief. And then there's a time to speak where the sadness subsides, and then we get going again. But I wanted to take that phrase and kind of also expand it and apply it to wisdom, that we need God's wisdom when to speak, and we need God's wisdom when to keep silent. With that being said, we do have a 15-minute intermission, and then we come back to have the Lord's Supper, and then after the Lord's Supper, we have our final message. This is more like a teaching. Everyone has a different personality, so I'm not a teacher per se. Some people can really teach, and they can go into the Greek and deep. I just kind of do the best I can. So if you didn't feel like it was a teaching format, that's my bad. But it's supposed to be a teaching format. And then we have a message where it's more like preaching. So we encourage you to stick around and hear the message after the Lord's Supper. With that being said, let's stand.